Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on the coronavirus impact on European aid for the most deprived.
The coronavirus crisis has made life even more difficult for the most deprived people in our society.
To protect them, as well as the workers and volunteers delivering aid to them, and ensure that no one falls through the net, the EU has had to take some exceptional measures. Stay with us.
Around 24 million people in the EU, that's just over 5% of the population, cannot afford to heat their homes properly, eat meat or fish regularly, or buy colour TV.
The concept of severe material deprivation is based on the inability to afford some items considered necessary or desirable for people to live in a decent way. It affects mostly single parents, single adults, and families with 3 or more children.
Across the EU, the problem is especially acute in Bulgaria, Greece and Romania, with Luxembourg and Scandinavian countries experiencing the lowest rates. So what is the EU doing to help this vulnerable group?
Since the onset of the 2008 financial and economic crisis, fighting poverty and social exclusion has become a key priority for the European Union. Since the late 1980s, the EU's food distribution programme for the most deprived has been using agricultural surpluses to ensure that no one is left without a meal.
And in 2012, the Commission announced the creation of a new fund for European aid to the most deprived. With more than €3.8 billion from the EU coffers, the fund seeks to alleviate the worst forms of poverty by providing assistance for the most deprived.
It also works in conjunction with Member States' national poverty eradication and social inclusion policies, supporting their actions to provide food and basic material assistance to the poorest, such as clothing and basic hygiene items.
Material assistance is complemented by social inclusion measures, as well as guidance and support to help people out of poverty, and it's managed by partner organisations selected by the Member States.
But the main funding instrument fighting poverty and social exclusion remains the European Social Fund. Although it was originally set up to promote employment, the ESF has evolved into a tool to reduce the risk of poverty through the empowerment of people to help themselves, the improvement of their quality of life, and the fight against poverty and marginalisation.
The EU is making progress towards its target of lifting at least 20 million out of poverty by 2020, but no one could foresee the devastating effects of the coronavirus. Stay with us.
With the spread of COVID-19 and the implementation of lockdowns across the EU, the severely deprived are finding it even more difficult to cope with the added social and financial difficulties.
To protect the most vulnerable and the workers and volunteers delivering the aid from falling victim to this disease, exceptional measures were taken to provide them with the necessary protective equipment.
In April 2020, the EU adapted the Fund for European Aid to the most deprived to meet new challenges. So what changes are we talking about?
Electronic vouchers were introduced to deliver food aid and basic material assistance, reducing the risk of contamination during delivery, as well as using the fund to buy protective equipment for those delivering the aid. Flexibility measures to simplify procedures and cut red tape have also been introduced to allow partner organisations to react quickly to the emerging additional needs of the most deprived arising from the crisis.
And for as long as this crisis lasts, the fund will be 100% EU financed, covering 15% normally paid by member states.
Moreover, to face one of the greatest labour crises and its social consequences on the most deprived, the EU has taken initiatives to address immediate needs and mitigate negative impacts on employment and social policy.
For example, the Commission has made €37 billion available from the structural funds to mitigate the impact of the crisis on the most vulnerable sectors, including labour markets, and allowed Member States greater flexibility in the use of cohesion policy funds. The European Commission has also decided to make additional money available for the Fund for European Aid to the Most Deprived for this year and the next too.
Since the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, the European Parliament has been at the forefront of the protection of the most deprived. It has emphasised the need to prioritise support measures for the most vulnerable, women and children exposed to domestic violence, the elderly and the disabled through an exceptional support fund.
Unfortunately, the crisis is not yet over, so immediate support measures may be needed to transform themselves into mid-term and even long-term measures.
But solidarity has always been one of the core values of the EU, so it's time to prove it.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.